I trusted them with my future. They robbed it. I remember the day I first met them as if it were yesterday, a crisp autumn morning with a hint of anticipation in the air. I had just stepped into a new phase of my life, fresh from college and burning with dreams of making a mark in the world. That day, I encountered a group of individuals who promised to shape my future. Their words were smooth, their smiles genuine, and the aura they carried was one of unyielding confidence. In that moment, I believed I had found the key to unlocking a destiny I had always yearned for. I had grown up in a small town where opportunity was scarce, where every dream felt as fragile as glass. So when they spoke about opening doors I'd never even known existed, of investments in education, career advancement, and financial security, I felt like I was being handed the keys to a better life. They weren't just offering services, they were offering hope. I listened rapt as they detailed a future painted in vibrant hues, far removed from the muted tones of my everyday existence. Their assurance was magnetic, drawing me in with the promise that my dreams were finally within reach. I trusted them. I trusted every word they spoke, every handshake, every shared secret about how the system truly worked. They explained things in simple, clear terms that made even the most complex ideas seem accessible. In our meetings, they would lean in, their eyes glimmering with the certainty of someone who had seen success and wanted to share that vision with me. I felt like I was part of something greater, a secret society of dreamers who were destined to rise above the mediocrity of our pasts. Every conversation was laced with excitement, every promise a stepping stone to a future that shimmered with potential. Over the following weeks, I invested not just my savings but my very soul into their plan. I followed their guidance, attended every seminar, and dove headfirst into projects that they assured me would pay off. I began to see the outlines of a future where I was no longer the timid, unsure person from a forgotten town, but a thriving individual on the brink of success. Every email, every meeting, every handshake deepened my commitment, convincing me that I was on the right. I was, after all, in the company of those who had clearly mastered the art of turning dreams into tangible outcomes. Yet as the months passed, subtle doubts began to creep in. There were moments when inconsistencies emerged, small details that didn't quite add up. I recall a late evening when I stayed back at the office, my eyes tired from poring over endless documents and promises that began to blur into one another. My heart pounded with the fear that perhaps I had been too naive, that I had trusted too easily. But every time I hesitated, I remembered their words, their unwavering belief in my potential, and I pushed the doubts aside. After all, hadn't they promised me a future free of regret? Turning point came on a chilly winter evening when the reality of my situation struck with a force I had not anticipated. I was alone in a small, dimly lit room, surrounded by the remnants of papers and plans that once held the promise of success. An unsettling silence filled the space as I realized that the meticulously built castle of dreams was beginning to crumble. The emails went unanswered, the calls unreturned, and the meetings, once filled with hope, had stopped altogether. It was as if the very foundation on which I had built my future was collapsing beneath me. In that moment, I felt a cold, piercing betrayal that cut through me like a knife. Sat there, grappling with a growing sense of dread, unable to reconcile the vibrant promises of yesterday with the harsh, empty silence of today. I had entrusted them with everything, my time, my savings, my future. And now, the stark reality was that they had stolen it from me, leaving behind only fragments of what once was a brilliant vision. The weight of their deception pressed upon me, and for the first time in a long while, I questioned every decision I had made. How could I have been so blind? How could I have let myself be swept away by the allure of a dream that turned out to be nothing more than an illusion? As I sat there in that lonely room, the betrayal and loss mingled with a simmering anger that I struggled to control. The trust I had placed in them had been my downfall, and the cost was far greater than I had ever imagined. I was left with a heart full of regret and a future that was now shrouded in uncertainty. In that moment of desolation, I vowed to find answers, to understand how something so promising could unravel so disastrous. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a long, painful journey into the depths of betrayal and the quest for redemption. The days following that bitter, disorienting evening, I found myself adrift in a tumult of confusion and self-recrimination. Every morning, I awoke with a heavy dread, a gnawing sense of loss and betrayal that seemed to seep into every corner of my life. The vibrant dreams of a promising future were now but fragmented memory, shards of a past that no longer existed. I spent countless hours retracing my steps, questioning every decision I had ever made, and wondering how I could have allowed myself to be so completely deceived. The initial shock had morphed into an insidious form of despair, and I realized that if I were to reclaim any semblance of control, I needed to understand exactly what had gone wrong. Determined to find answers, I embarked on a painstaking journey of investigation. I began by digging through every email, every contract, every promise that had been etched into paper and pixel. Each document was a reminder of the trust I had once placed in those who now seemed like shadows from a nightmare. As I pored over the details, I discovered inconsistencies, minor at first, but gradually they revealed a pattern of manipulation. Carefully constructed facade of opportunity was built on a shaky foundation of half-truths and vague assurances. With each piece of evidence, the reality of the betrayal grew clearer, and yet the more I uncovered, the more questions arose. Who were these people really, and what had motivated them to weave such an intricate web of deceit? I began reaching out to former acquaintances who had once shared in the excitement of those meetings, hoping that someone might offer a clue or shed light on the enigma that now haunted my every waking moment. Some, too, had been drawn in by the allure of a better tomorrow, and were now silently nursing their own wound. In hushed conversations over coffee and late-night phone calls, fragments of a troubling picture began to emerge. There were whispers of a larger scheme, one that involved not just individual dreams, but the futures of many desperate souls. I listened intently as others recounted similar experiences, promises made in a comforting tone, only to vanish like smoke when reality intruded. The stories resonated with my own, each one a stark reminder that I was not alone in my suffering, yet the isolation of betrayal made it hard to trust even these shared experiences. In the midst of my investigation, I experienced moments of overwhelming vulnerability. At night, when the world was silent and the darkness pressed in around me, I would lie awake, my mind racing with thoughts of what had been and what might have been. The chill of regret was inescapable, and I often questioned if I had been foolish or simply too hopeful. The dreams that once buoyed me now served as a painful reminder of the life that had slipped away. Yet beneath the despair, a simmering determination began to kindle. I realized that, while my future had been stolen, the only way to move forward was to piece together the puzzle of my own downfall, and perhaps, in doing so, find a path to redemption. Started to document everything, recording my thoughts, dates, and the minutiae of every interaction with those who had vanished without a trace. This exercise was both therapeutic and necessary. By writing down my recollections, I was not only preserving the details for a potential reckoning, but also reclaiming my narrative. It was as if I was slowly stitching together the torn fabric of my identity, each word a small act of resistance against the overwhelming force of betrayal. I began to sense that this journey was about more than just uncovering a fraud. It was about understanding the nature of trust, the vulnerability that accompanies hope, and the strength that comes from facing one's own despair. As the weeks turned into months, my investigation took unexpected twists and turns. I encountered dead ends, clues, and even moments when the shadows of doubt nearly overwhelmed my resolve. Yet every time I felt my determination waver, I reminded myself that the truth was worth the struggle. I contacted individuals who had once been part of the inner circle of that enigmatic organization, and though many were reluctant to speak, a few hinted at a labyrinth of internal conflicts and financial irregularities pointed to something much larger than a single act of deceit. These revelations were both terrifying and galvanizing. They confirmed my worst fears while simultaneously fueling my need to expose the truth. This descent into uncertainty, I began to understand that betrayal is not merely an external act. It carves deep into the soul, leaving scars that are both visible and invisible. Every discovery, every conversation, further eroded the illusions I had once clung to so desperately. Yet in that erosion, I also found the raw materials for rebuilding something stronger, something more resilient. My journey was no longer just about reclaiming a stolen future. It was about rediscovering who I was beneath the layers of trust and hope, and learning to navigate a world where certainty was a rare commodity. And so, even as the shadows of deception loomed large, I took each step forward, driven by the unyielding belief that I could transform my pain into a testament of survival and growth. In the aftermath of my initial investigations, I found myself spiraling deeper into a labyrinth of deception, a maze where every turn seemed to lead me closer to an elusive truth, and yet further from the comfort of certainty. The days grew longer as I pored over documents, intercepted cryptic messages, and reconnected with old contacts who were once enthusiastic believers in the promise of a transformed future. Every small clue felt like a fragile thread that could either weave a tapestry of understanding or unravel entirely, leaving me stranded in a void of unanswered questions. I felt as though I was standing at the edge of a precipice, the ground crumbling beneath my feet as I gazed into the darkness below. Decided to revisit the meeting places where I had once felt so secure and hopeful. The upscale cafes, the modest conference rooms, and even the quiet corners of public libraries where whispers of ambition mingled with the rustle of paper. It was in these familiar yet now eerie locations that I began piecing together the remnants of my shattered trust. I met a few individuals who, like me, had been ensnared by the seductive promise of a brighter future. Over long, sleepless nights filled with restless chatter and reluctant confessions, we exchanged stories of hope, loss, and betrayal. Their voices, laced with regret and lingering anger, echoed my own internal turmoil. In these conversations, I discovered that I was not an isolated, rather, I was part of a much larger network of dreams that had been callously exploited. One evening, as rain pounded against my apartment window, I received an unexpected message from someone who claimed to have insider information. The note was brief and cryptic, a single sentence suggesting that there were hidden accounts and secret meetings orchestrated by the very people I had once trusted. My heart raced as I absorbed the implications. If these insiders were willing to break their silence, then perhaps there was a way to dismantle the entire structure of deceit that had ruined so many lives. The prospect of confronting this sprawling network both terrified and invigorated me. I embarked on a mission to meet this mysterious informant, determined to extract every bit of detail that could help me trace the origins of the betrayal. The meeting was set in a dimly lit, nondescript diner on the outskirts of town, a place where anonymity was guaranteed and secrets could be traded like currency. As I sat across from a middle-aged man whose eyes betrayed years of quiet suffering, he began to unravel a story that was both complex and chilling. Described described how the organization operated like a well-oiled machine, recruiting hopeful souls with promises of financial freedom and personal growth, only to siphon off their investments into shadowy channels that were nearly impossible to trace. His words painted a picture of meticulously orchestrated meetings, hidden bank accounts, and a hierarchy that was as enigmatic as it was ruthless. I listened intently, the sound of clinking coffee cups punctuating the gravity of his revelations, each detail reinforcing the painful truth that I had been complicit in my own downfall. Every new piece of evidence that surfaced, the web of deceit grew more intricate and foreboding. I began noticing pattern, a series of dates that coincided with sudden disappearances of figures, odd transactions recorded in obscure financial ledgers, and a recurring mention of offshore entities that seemed to hold the bulk of the stolen fortune. The deeper I delved, the more I realized that I was facing a sophisticated operation, one that had mastered the art of erasing its own traces. I spent nights cross-referencing documents, drawing timelines on my wall, and scribbling frenzied notes in worn-out journals. My apartment transformed into a chaotic command center, with newspapers, receipts, and faded photographs strewn across every surface, a physical manifestation of the mental turmoil that gripped. The revelation that struck me the hardest was not the scale of the deception, but the human cost behind it. I began to read letters and listen to recordings from others who had been left in ruin, stories of families torn apart by financial ruin, of dreams buried under the weight of betrayal, and of lives that had been irreparably altered by the cold calculation of those who preyed on hope. It was in these personal narratives that I saw my own reflection, and it filled me with a resolve to pursue justice, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been robbed of their future. I was no longer the passive dreamer. I was a fighter, driven by the fierce desire to expose the truth. With each step closer to the heart of the conspiracy, the danger grew ever more palpable. I began to receive veiled warning, anonymous calls, unsettling emails, and even a late-night knock on my door that left me trembling in fear. The shadows that had once concealed the organization now seemed to be closing in around me, and I was caught in a relentless game of cat and mouse with forces far more powerful than I had ever imagined. Despite the mounting risks, I pressed on, bolstered by the belief that uncovering the full extent of the betrayal was the only way to reclaim what had been stolen. The journey was treacherous, filled with moments of despair and fleeting glimpses of hope, each step deepening my understanding of the intricate web of lies that had ensnared us all. Those dark hours, as I navigated the perilous path toward the truth, I learned that trust, once broken, leaves scars that are slow to heal. But I also discovered an inner strength, a resilience forged in the crucible of betrayal and loss. With every revelation, every secret unveiled, I was slowly piecing together not only the puzzle of my stolen future, but also the fragments of my identity that had been lost along the way. The unraveling web was daunting, but it was also a path toward redemption, a path that I knew I had to follow, no matter where it might lead. The deeper I delved, the more I began to realize that every clue I uncovered was merely a doorway to yet another labyrinth of secrets. Late one rainy night, as I sat hunched over a cluttered desk in my dimly lit apartment, I noticed a detail in an old ledger that had been overlooked, a discrepancy in a series of transactions that pointed to a hidden network of accounts. My heart pounded as I stared at the numbers, feeling both the weight of the betrayal and the exhilarating promise of uncovering something critical. I knew that beneath the polished facade of promises lay a far murkier truth, one that was carefully concealed and guarded by those who had so artfully deceived me and so many others. The ensuing days, my search became all-consuming. I retraced every lead, contacted every acquaintance, and re-examined every document with renewed determination. I found myself revisiting the dark corners of public records, exploring bank statements and financial trails that many would have dismissed as irrelevant detail. Yet every odd entry, every unfamiliar name, seemed to pulse with significance as if it were a heartbeat of the sprawling deception that had stolen my future. I felt a growing urgency, a need to peel back each layer of this hidden operation, even if it meant exposing parts of myself I had long kept buried. During one particularly tense afternoon at a local library, while scanning through a set of archived news articles, I noticed a pattern that tied several local businesses to offshore companies. It was a connection that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. My mind raced as I pieced together the timeline. Each article, each mention of a seemingly unrelated corporation, now resonated with the possibility that these were pieces of a much larger puzzle. I scribbled notes on scraps of paper and filled margins with annotations, feeling that I was on the brink of uncovering something monumental. Every discovery stirred both hope and dread in equal measure. The deeper I looked, the more I realized that I was challenging forces that had long evaded the scrutiny of the average person. At evening, with the rain still tapping relentlessly on my window, I received a call from someone who identified themselves only by a distorted voice. The caller claimed to have information that could tie the entire network of deceit directly to those who had lured me in with so many empty promises. The conversation was brief but searing. The voice warned me to tread carefully, to not let my guard down even for a moment. The threat was implicit, a reminder that my investigation was not just about unmasking a fraud. It had now become a battle for my very safe. Phone call sent shivers down my spine, yet it also ignited a stubborn resolve. I could not allow fear to paralyze me when every moment was a step closer to the truth. The days that followed, I began meeting with a small, secretive group of individuals who had also been scorned by this elaborate scheme. In a quiet, abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, its cavernous interior echoing with the memories of better days. We exchanged our finding, each story a thread in the vast tapestry of deception. Their accounts were raw and painful, yet they confirmed what I had long suspected. We were all victims of a calculated con. Every shared detail, every tearful recollection, deepened my conviction that our lives had been manipulated for profit, our futures bartered like commodity. While my new allies offered a collective strength, they also carried their own scars, and the room was heavy with the silent understanding of our shared betrayal. I listened intently as one of them recounted a particularly harrowing experience, a near encounter with a man in a dark suit who had warned him against digging too deep. It was a chilling reminder that the forces behind this conspiracy would stop at nothing to protect their interests. That moment cemented in my mind that the path I was on was fraught with danger. Yet I pressed on, driven by the unyielding need to reclaim the narrative of my life. Every piece of evidence I gathered seemed to hint at an even larger, more sinister network operating behind closed doors. The realization was overwhelming. I wasn't just unraveling a single fraud, but a system designed to exploit hope and ambition for personal gain. As the shadows of doubt and fear crept in during the long, sleepless nights, I had to remind myself that the truth was my only weapon against the overwhelming tide of lies. With each new document, each whispered warning, I felt my determination solidify into an unbreakable resolve. At night, as I sat by a single desk lamp, the glow illuminating the scattered pages of my growing file, I knew that I had reached a pivotal moment. I was no longer merely a victim of betrayal. I had transformed into an investigator, a seeker of truths hidden beneath layers of deceit. Beneath the surface of every polished promise lay the bitter residue of shattered dreams and stolen futures, and I was determined to expose it all, no matter the personal. At this stage in my journey, I felt as though I was teetering on the very edge of discovery, caught between the burning desire to expose the truth and the gnawing fear of what that truth might unleash. The past weeks had been an endless pursuit of hidden detail, a relentless climb up a mountain of secrets where each step forward felt both exhilarating and dangerously uncertain. Every whispered conversation, every fleeting piece of evidence, drew me closer to a revelation that could shatter the lives of those behind the betrayal, and possibly mine as well. One foggy night, I found myself parked in a desolate lot near an abandoned industrial complex. The night was cold, and the heavy mist clung to everything like a shroud. I had been following a trail of clues that hinted at a clandestine meeting, a gathering of the very people who had lured me into their web of promises. The thought that this might be the moment when I finally gathered indisputable evidence sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I sat in my car with my heart pounding, the soft hum of the engine the only sound in an otherwise suffocating silence. The gravity of the situation pressed upon me. I knew that attending this meeting might be the most dangerous risk I'd ever take. Time seemed to stretch indefinitely as I waited, each minute heavy with anticipation. I reflected on the days that had led me here, the late nights poring over documents, the anxious phone calls, the secret rendezvous in dimly lit cafes, and the countless moments of doubt and determination. Every fragment of the past weeks had been building towards this night, each small revelation a stepping stone toward what I hoped would be a break. Just as the cold began to feel unbearable, I noticed headlights cutting through the fog. A sleek, black sedan glided to a stop a few cars away, and I knew that the meeting was underway. I watched intently as several individuals emerged from the vehicle, their faces partially obscured by the haze and the deep shadows of the night. They moved with a purposeful, almost rehearsed precision, each step measured and deliberate as they made their way toward the side entrance of the complex. I switched on my recording device, my hands trembling slightly as I fumbled with the control. Every detail mattered. Every word, every pause, every subtle inflection in their voices could be the key to unlocking the true scope of their operation. From my hidden vantage point, I listened to their conversation as it drifted out into the cold air. Their dialogue was low and urgent, filled with references to undisclosed offshore accounts, large sums of money being funneled through shadowy channels, and warnings against any further scrutiny. Even though I could only catch fragments, each snippet confirmed the enormity of the deception. It was as if I had stumbled upon a secret meeting of conspirators, and every word they exchanged deepened the mystery while also hinting at an imminent, catastrophic move, final consolidation of power that would ensure their control remained absolute. Yet amid the cryptic discussion, an unsettling detail began to surface. There was an intensity in one speaker's tone, a subtle shift that conveyed a sense of urgency and impending change. His voice, firm and resolute, outlined plans that were far more drastic than I had ever imagined. He mentioned a series of coordinated actions meant to silence dissent and tighten their grip, actions that could have dire consequences not for their victim, but for anyone who dared to interfere. My heart raced as I recorded every word, the magnitude of the betrayal I had endured suddenly expanding into a vast, dangerous conspiracy. In the midst of capturing these crucial moments, a sharp movement at the edge of my vision signaled that I was no longer a mere observer in the shadow. I caught a fleeting glimpse of a figure, an unmistakable sign that someone had noticed my presence. Panic surged through me. Without a moment to lose, I silenced my recorder, pocketed it quickly, and slipped out of my car into the dark, misty night. Every instinct screamed at me to run, and I obeyed, my footsteps echoing in the deserted streets as I darted away from the scene. The risk was enormous, but I knew that the evidence I had just gathered was too important to abandon. Later, as I collapsed into the relative safety of my apartment, every nerve in my body still still on high alert, I replayed the events of the night in my mind. The whispered secrets, the furtive glances, and that moment of exposure, all of it painted a picture of a conspiracy so deep and wide that it threatened to engulf everything I had once believed in. I sat in the dim light, the recording device resting on the table beside me, a silent promise of the truth waiting to be revealed. I was now standing on the very brink of a revelation that could shatter the entire operation and expose the dark forces that had robbed me of my future. And as the first hints of dawn began to break through the fog, I resolved that no matter how perilous the road ahead, I would follow it to its bitter, unyielding end. In the weeks that followed my near-disastrous night at the clandestine meeting, the atmosphere around me shifted dramatically. Every day, I awoke with an unshakable feeling of being watched, a cold, creeping dread that clung to my every step. It wasn't just paranoia. The evidence I'd painstakingly gathered seemed to have stirred a hornet's nest. I found myself ensnared in a web that tightened around me with every passing moment, and I knew that if I wasn't careful, full weight of the conspiracy would come crashing down. My apartment, once a sanctuary filled with memories of hope and quiet determination, now felt like a gilded cage. Every creak of the floorboard and every unexpected shadow made my heart race. I started receiving ominous messages, short, cryptic texts that simply read, "Stop digging," or "We know." Each notification was a stark reminder that the forces I was up against were not only organized, but were prepared to silence anyone who threatened to expose them. I could feel the pressure building, like a storm gathering strength, and I realized I had reached a point of no return. Determined not to let fear paralyze me, I decided to press on with my investigation. I meticulously cross-checked every scrap of evidence, every note that I had scribbled in moments of both hope and despair. Late one night, as I sat in the dim glow of a desk lamp, I received a call from an unknown number. My pulse quickened as I answered, expecting another veiled warning. Instead, a familiar voice greeted me, a voice I had not heard in months. It was someone from the inner circle, someone I once trusted implicitly. His tone was subdued, burdened by a sense of urgency that immediately put me on edge. He revealed details that shook me to my core. Accounts had been frozen, secret meetings had been abrupt canceled, and there were whispers of an impending move that would sweep away any remaining trace of our collective evidence. It was as if the conspirators had sensed my growing resolve and were mobilizing their forces to erase any lingering opposition. I listened intently, the weight of his words settling heavily on my shoulder. I was no longer just an investigator retracing broken promises. I was a target in a high-stakes game where the cost of failure could be my very life. The conversation left me reeling and propelled me into action. I began to coordinate with a small group of like-minded individuals who had suffered at the hands of this elaborate scheme. Together, we pooled our resources, shared our discoveries, and devised a plan to safeguard our evidence. Every meeting we held was shrouded in secrecy and conducted in locations far from prying eyes, abandoned parking lots, remote cafes after hours, and even underground networks of trusted. With every discussion, the realization grew that our once personal quest for redemption had become a collective battle against a deeply entrenched system of deceit. However, our collaboration came at a steep. One evening, while I was returning from one of our secret rendezvous points, I noticed a black car trailing me slowly. The vehicle's headlights were dimmed, presence almost ghostly in the twilight. My heart hammered in my chest as I accelerated, trying desperately to lose my tail in the maze of city streets. The chase felt endless, every turn in the road a gamble with. I finally managed to evade the car in a narrow alleyway, but the encounter left me shaken, a visceral reminder that my actions had not gone unnoticed. In the aftermath, sleepless nights became the norm. The fear of being caught by those who wanted to silence me loomed larger than ever. I began to wonder if my quest for truth was worth the mounting risks. Doubts crept in during the darkest hours before dawn, questions of whether the lives ruined by this conspiracy could ever be restored, and if I was foolishly stirring a hornet's nest with no hope of escape. Yet every time those doubts threatened to overwhelm me, I remembered the faces of the countless victims and the promises that were so callously shattered. I knew that retreat was not an option. Pressure culminated in a tense confrontation when a trusted ally, a friend who had also suffered immense losses, was ambushed on his way home. The attack was swift and brutal, leaving him injured and terrified, a stark testament to the lengths the conspirators would go to protect their secret. That incident was a turning point, a moment that forced me to confront the perilous reality of my situation. I had stepped into the lion's den, and now the lions were circling ever closer. Every decision, every cautious step I took now felt laced with danger. The fear that once threatened to paralyze me gradually transformed into a steely determination. I realized that the only way to reclaim our stolen futures was to face these shadows head-on, even if it meant risking everything. As I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the night, I steeled myself for what lay ahead. The conspirators had already shown that they were willing to use violence to keep their secrets buried. Now, I had to muster every ounce of courage, resolve, and resilience to expose them and reclaim the narrative of my life. Fragile moment between fear and defiance, I recognized that my journey had evolved beyond a personal quest. It had become a fight for justice for all who had been deceived. The road ahead was treacherous, littered with shadows that threatened to engulf us. But as the night deepened around me, I resolved to push forward into the unknown, ready to confront the danger with unyielding determination and the hope that truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually see the light of day. After countless sleepless nights, near escapes, and a relentless pursuit of the truth, I finally found myself standing at the crossroads of destiny and despair. Every step of my journey, every clandestine meeting, Every whispered warning and every harrowing discovery had led me to this pivotal moment where the tangled web of deceit would either crumble under the weight of justice or pull me further into its depth. I had come too far to turn back. The days leading up to the confrontation, the tension was nearly unbearable. The messages grew more ominous, and the shadows in every corner of my life became increasingly menacing. I felt the heavy hand of the conspirators tightening around me, a constant reminder that my every move was being watched. Yet with every threat, my resolve only hardened. I spent long hours assembling the final pieces of evidence, recordings, financial documents, and testimonies from others who had been victimized by the same ruthless network. Each piece was a brick in the wall of proof I was constructing against those who had stolen not only my future, but the futures of so many others. The decisive moment came on an overcast afternoon when I arranged a covert meeting with a trusted investigative journalist who had been following the trail of similar cases. We met in a quiet, out-of-the-way cafe, its atmosphere thick with anticipation and unspoken understanding. As we pored over the documents I had meticulously compiled, the gravity of the situation became even more apparent. The evidence was irrefutable, a labyrinth of offshore accounts, suspicious transactions, and testimonies that wove together a picture of a meticulously planned fraud. Together, we devised a plan to bring this conspiracy into the light. The journalist promised that once the story broke, the ripple effect would be unstoppable. The night before the planned exposé, anxiety clawed at my inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into the lion's den, that the final step toward justice might also be the most dangerous. I found myself in a quiet park, staring up at a sky heavy with clouds, and contemplating all the risks I had taken. Every decision, every sacrifice had led me to that. I recalled the faces of those who had suffered, the friends, the family members, and even strangers whose lives had been derailed by the intricate lies that had promised and delivered ruin. Their silent suffering was a constant reminder that my mission was not just about my own shattered dreams, but about restoring the dignity and futures of all those who had been betrayed. As dawn broke on the day of the exposé, I felt a surreal calm descend upon me. With a heavy heart and a mind sharpened by adversity, I delivered the final documents and recordings to the journalist, along with a plea to ensure that the story reached every corner of society. The narrative that unfolded was explosive, a detailed account of how my future, along with many others, had been manipulated and stolen by an organization that thrived on exploitation and deception. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story, and the carefully constructed facade of respectability began to crumble before the public eye. Fallout was swift and overwhelming. Authorities, now armed with undeniable proof, began raiding offices, freezing accounts, and detaining several key figures behind the scheme. I watched, both from a distance and with a profound sense of bittersweet satisfaction, as the very people who had once promised salvation were exposed as predators. Yet even as justice started to take shape, I was keenly aware of the personal cost of this crusade. I had lost trust, money, and a part of my innocence along the way. The scars of betrayal were deep and would take time to heal, but in the midst of the chaos, I felt a glimmer of redemption. The aftermath of the reckoning, I found myself grappling with a mix of relief and sorrow. The exposé had brought relief to countless victims, igniting calls for reform and tighter regulations to prevent such exploitation in the future. The conspirators, now on trial, could no longer hide behind their carefully constructed lie. I realized that while the battle for justice had been arduous and costly, it had also restored a measure of control over my own narrative. I had reclaimed not only my stolen future, but also my voice. Sitting alone in the quiet of my modest apartment that evening, I reflected on the long, winding road that had brought me here. The journey had been marked by loss, betrayal, and fear, but it was also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. I had learned that sometimes, the path to reclaiming one's future requires confronting the darkest parts of the present. And as I gazed out the window at the city slowly waking to a new dawn, a dawn of accountability and hope, I knew that despite the pain and the scars, a new chapter in my life was beginning. A chapter built on hard-won lessons, the courage to speak out, and an unyielding belief that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually see the light of day.